The desert is silent now. But long ago, before words were carved into stone or fire tamed the dark, this land whispered something only a few would ever understand. Here, where sand dunes move like oceans and time seems to hang in the heat, a secret survived, not in monuments or myths, but inside people, inside their blood. It begins not with a kingdom or a hero, but with a question. Who were the first humans? And if we want to find their footprints, not the ones made in wet riverbanks, but the ones left in our very cells, we must come here, to Namibia. The world has been taught to look north for the origins of civilization, east for the earliest migrations, and west for the stories of progress. But Namibia, almost always forgotten in the grand narrative, may be where it all truly began. Among its people, especially the San, often mislabeled simply as Bushmen, scientists have found something that rewrites what we thought we knew. Their DNA doesn't just go back far, it goes back deep. Deeper than pyramids, deeper than agriculture, deeper than almost anything else we've ever studied. It's not just old, it's diverse, the most diverse in the world. And that matters, because the further back you go in human history, the more diversity you should find in the place we all came from. That's how genetics works. The San people, living in Namibia's harsh but timeless landscape, carry the echoes of a human story that's nearly 300,000 years old. You might wonder, how can a people in such a remote corner hold the blueprint of all of us? It's because they never left. While others migrated north, west, and out of Africa entirely, the ancestors of the San stayed in the south. They endured ice ages and droughts, foreign invasions and colonial horrors. But through it all, something inside them stayed untouched, preserved, like a message from the beginning of us. Their DNA is a museum, a living archive, not of fossils, but of raw, living history, coursing through their veins with every heartbeat. It doesn't just tell us who they are, it tells us who we are. But most people don't know this. In textbooks and classrooms, the San are barely mentioned. In tourist brochures, they're reduced to primitive caricatures. Yet in laboratories from Cape Town to Cambridge, their DNA is studied with reverence. Not because they are primitive, but because they are original. Think of it. In a world chasing the future, a small community, living on the edge of the Namib, holds the past that science is still trying to understand. And that's the mystery. That's the irony. That a people considered simple have genetic complexity more profound than most populations on Earth. That a landscape seen as barren may be the cradle of everything. Namibia doesn't just carry evidence of early humans. It may be the reason humanity survived. The San people aren't living fossils. They are living memory. Their genome is a bridge spanning across millennia, untouched by empires and unsilenced by time. So the next time someone asks, where do we come from? Don't point to a map. Point to Namibia. There are places in the world where time breaks down. Not because the clock stopped, but because the past and present blur. Southern Namibia is one of them. Beneath its red dunes and silent plains lies something older than cities, older than writing, older than memory itself. What if we told you that inside the cells of a people who still walk this land is evidence of a human chapter written tens of thousands of years before the first tools were forged in Mesopotamia? What if you could look into their DNA and see the edge of humanity's beginning? It wasn't found in a tomb. It wasn't dug up from a burial mound. It came from living people, individuals who still speak, sing, and hunt under the open African sky. When researchers began sequencing the genomes of the San people, particularly the Jew, Hoansi, what they discovered sent shockwaves through the scientific community. These individuals carried genetic variants that are more ancient and more diverse than those found anywhere else on Earth. Why is that so important? Because genetic diversity is like a time capsule. The more diversity a population holds, the closer it is to the source. Imagine humanity's genome as a river. The further it flows, the more it narrows. But in Namibia, that river is still wide, wild, untamed, and filled with ancient tributaries that have long since dried up elsewhere. The study led by Sarah Tishkoff in 2009 was the first to fully reveal this. It showed that while the rest of the world's populations are the result of migrations, mixtures, and bottlenecks, the San have been holding onto the original manuscript. Not a copy, the original. And that changes everything. Because if their DNA holds the oldest branches of our family tree, then the implications go far beyond Africa. It reshapes our entire species' origin story. For centuries, we've built human history backwards, starting with the great civilizations, moving through colonization, then back to early migrations. But here in Namibia, that order collapses. This isn't the end of the timeline. It may be the beginning. And it's not just the Jew, Hoansi. Other groups, like the Hai, Om, the Nama, and the Damara, each add another layer, a different shade in the spectrum of ancient human identity. Their genes show lineages that split off long before modern humans left Africa, before we settled Asia or Europe, before the very idea of countries or tribes existed. So what does it mean when a group of people living today carry DNA so old it predates nearly everything we know? It means we've been telling the human story from the wrong end. It means our modernity is not the climax of evolution. It's a footnote to something far grander. These communities, often seen by outsiders as less developed, are in fact genetic time travelers. Their cells remember a world we've forgotten, a world before nations, before race, before history began carving itself into stone. And here's what makes it even more extraordinary. This diversity, this genetic treasure, survived against all odds. Climate change, colonization, displacement, disease. Yet it's still here, carried in the blood of real people, people who still dance to rhythms older than writing, and speak in clicks that echo the first languages ever formed. No archaeological dig, no ancient manuscript, no high-tech simulation can replace this. These are not just data points. They are living origins. Human evolution didn't happen in a single place or a single time. It happened across landscapes, across bodies, across thousands of silent generations. And in Namibia, the echoes of that journey are still alive. So if the edges of our species began here, what does that say about where we're going? Across the vast silence of the Namib, there are no ruins of lost empires, no towering pyramids, no broken columns buried beneath the sand. And yet, this desert hides a lineage more enduring than stone. Because long before Africa was carved into nations, before the names of kingdoms echoed through the valleys, people lived here, not as conquerors or builders, but as carriers of something far more enduring, memory encoded in their blood. What if you learned that in this barren stretch of land, cut off from rivers and roads, there exists a group whose DNA holds a secret not seen in any other population? A lineage untouched by the great Bantu migrations, a whisper from a forgotten age, preserved in genetic silence for thousands of years. This is not a myth. It's science. And the story begins in the Namib Desert. A recent study conducted in Angolan Namib, bordering Namibia, unveiled something extraordinary. A genetic signal hidden in the DNA of local populations that doesn't match any known Bantu-speaking ancestry. In fact, it predates it entirely. These people, descendants of small-scale foraging communities, carry a distinct genetic legacy that dates back to a time when agriculture didn't yet exist and cattle were still wild. They speak languages that barely survive today. Among them were the last known speakers of the Kwadi language, now extinct. But even after their words fell silent, their genes continued to speak. And what they say challenges everything we thought we knew about Africa's genetic landscape. Because this unique ancestry isn't just old. It's isolated. It shows no signs of the sweeping genetic homogenization that followed the Bantu expansion. While much of Africa became a genetic mosaic, the Namib Desert became something else entirely, a refuge. Here, time slowed down. Populations remained small, scattered, and mobile. And because of this, their DNA retained the echoes of a world that existed before migration reshaped the continent. But the desert wasn't just protecting bloodlines. It was protecting stories. And now, through genome sequencing, we can finally read them. The researchers found that this pre-Bantu lineage is deeply divergent from modern African genetic clusters. It doesn't resemble East African pastoralist DNA, nor does it align with the West African roots of most Bantu speakers. It stands alone, a branch from the earliest forks of the human genetic tree, still alive in people who continue to live close to the earth, gathering wild tubers, tracking animals, and navigating the ancient rhythms of the land. And what's more astonishing, this genetic signature has remained largely invisible until recently, because these populations were small, isolated, ignored. But now their significance is undeniable. It's not just about Namibia. It's about the possibility that other forgotten pockets of ancient ancestry may still exist across the continent and beyond. It reminds us that history isn't always where the noise is. Sometimes it's where the silence held. While cities rose and fell, while empires marched and borders shifted, the desert kept a piece of the beginning locked away. Not behind walls, but in the genome. In this sense, the lost tribes of the Namib were never really lost. They were simply overlooked. Their DNA tells a story that maps cannot. A story before the map, before language split, before the continent was named. Their genes are the footprints of a forgotten journey, preserved in skin and bone, protected by a desert that never forgot. In most of the world, language draws the lines, tribes, borders, identities, all defined by the words we speak. But in Namibia, those lines blur. Here, genetics refuses to follow the rules of language. Imagine two communities. They live miles apart, speak entirely different languages, practice separate customs. And yet, deep inside their cells, their ancestry is almost identical. Then take two neighboring groups who share a language, culture, even rituals, only to find their DNA diverges like distant branches of a tree. How is that possible? This is not a linguistic puzzle. It's a genetic revelation. Recent genomic studies across southern Africa uncovered a stunning anomaly. Namibia's populations are shaped more by geography than by language or culture. The further apart two communities live, the more distinct their DNA tends to be, regardless of what tongue they speak or how they survive. This pattern defies conventional understanding and points to something older than any spoken word, a history written in migration, isolation, and survival. It's a phenomenon known as isolation by distance. Over thousands of years, people moved slowly across vast deserts and mountains, forming bonds with those nearby. But not because they shared dialects or beliefs. They shared space. And in Namibia, space is everything. The harshness of the landscape carved invisible genetic borders. Sand dunes that stretch endlessly. Rocky outcrops that separate valleys. Sparse water sources that dictated where humans could survive. These physical barriers didn't just shape where people lived, they shaped who they became. As a result, Khoisan-speaking groups like the Nama and Hai, OM, while culturally linked, have surprisingly different genetic profiles. Meanwhile, groups with no shared language, like the Damara and certain central Khoisan populations, show closer genetic proximity than anyone expected. This confusion isn't a glitch. It's a clue. A clue that language can evolve faster than DNA. That words, shaped by conquest, trade, or assimilation, can shift in a few generations. But genomes don't lie. They carry the scars and stories of ancient separations, sometimes thousands of years old, hidden beneath the surface of daily life. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the tripartite structure of Khoisan ancestry. Geneticists have mapped it into three broad clusters: northern, central, and southern. But these clusters don't match the linguistic map. They don't align neatly with who speaks what, or how they survive. They follow only one law, the law of the land. This rewrites how we understand identity. Because if two people share a language, but not a lineage, who are they to each other? And if two strangers have matching ancestry despite no shared tongue, are they more connected than they think? In Namibia, identity cannot be reduced to tribe or tongue. It must be read through the deeper lens of genetic memory, through sequences passed down from ancestors who lived before language even existed. But there's something haunting about this too. It suggests that much of what we believe defines us, our names, our stories, even our origin myths, may only skim the surface. Beneath them lies an older, stranger story, one that doesn't always translate, one that cannot be told in words, only uncovered in strands of DNA. So when we ask who we are, we must learn to ask it differently, not in the voice of language, but in the silence of code. Because in Namibia, some of the most ancient human truths are still spoken in a language no one can hear, but everyone carries. There's a quiet kind of chaos buried in Namibian DNA. a tangled record of footsteps, whispered in blood, that spans not just centuries, but entire epochs of movement, collision, and change. This isn't a neat lineage. It's not a straight line from one ancient tribe to a modern identity. It's a layered map of migrations, unexpected crossings, and sudden intrusions. And while Namibia may seem isolated today, its genome tells a different story, one of relentless encounters, each one reshaping what came before. The first cracks appeared thousands of years ago, long before colonial ships touched African shores. East African pastoralists were already on the move, herding livestock through the savannas, carrying not just animals, but genes that would quietly mingle with indigenous foragers. These weren't invasions. They were slow infiltrations, moments of intermarriage, cooperation, perhaps even conflict, that left lasting impressions on the genetic makeup of Namibia's people. But that was only the beginning. Roughly 2 millennia ago, the Bantu expansion surged across the continent like a tide. Agriculturalists from the northwest brought new languages, iron tools, and a powerful demographic presence. When they reached southern Africa, they didn't erase the older populations, they absorbed them. Over generations, Khoisan groups began to reflect the influence, and at times, the dominance, of Bantu ancestry. And yet, some resisted. Others were protected by the unforgiving landscapes of the Namib and Kalahari. The result? A genetic map that doesn't fade evenly, but splinters. Certain groups, like the Damara, exhibit a strong blend, heavily admixed with Bantu-like ancestry. Others, like the Jew, Hoansi, remain far less touched, as if guarded by the wilderness itself. But then came the storm no one could avoid. The colonial era didn't just redraw political borders, it injected entirely new lineages into the DNA of southern Africa. European settlers, German, Dutch, British, left behind more than buildings and borders. They left blood, and that blood, detectable in today's genetic sequencing, appears in unexpected places, sometimes in low traces, sometimes in shocking amounts. This recent admixture, some of it occurring less than 10 generations ago, adds another layer of complexity. It didn't replace ancient DNA, but it intertwined with it, making it harder to untangle the threads. And yet, when analyzed with precision, each strand still tells its own story. Some lineages speak of ancient foragers who never moved, others of migrants who traveled for weeks before settling beside a spring. Still others of colonial unions, both violent and consensual, that permanently altered family trees. What makes Namibia unique is that all of these stories are still alive, not in documents, not in legends, but in the people themselves. And it's not just about where those ancestors came from. It's about when they arrived. Geneticists can now trace when admixture events happened. Some are ancient, traced back over 200 generations. Others are as recent as the 19th century. These timelines reveal not just who contributed to Namibia's gene pool, but how often, how suddenly, and how deeply they left their mark. Each population, Nama, Damara, Hai, Om, Herero, holds a different version of this history, like chapters in the same book, written in different dialects, bound by the same dust. So when we speak of Namibian DNA, we're not looking at a single ancestry. We're looking at a symphony of migrations, some ancient and slow, others recent and violent. Every gene is a footprint. Every footprint has a direction, and every direction reveals a part of the truth. If you could trace your lineage not just centuries, but hundreds of millennia into the past, where would it lead? Would it point to a medieval castle? A pharaoh's tomb? Or would it lead instead to a sun-scorched plain in southern Africa, where no empire ever stood, and no ancient monument remains? In Namibia, the answer may already lie within us. This isn't mythology. It's molecular evidence, etched into the chromosomes of the living, whispering truths from a time when modern humans had barely begun to walk upright. And the signals are clear. Some of the world's oldest maternal and paternal lineages are still alive here, breathing, walking, speaking in languages full of ancient clicks and tones that no algorithm can replicate. Start with the paternal line. Scientists tracking the human Y chromosome, the genetic trail passed from father to son, have found something astonishing in Namibian populations, especially among the San and Nama. A genetic marker known as haplogroup A L1085 appears here in extraordinary concentrations. It's not just rare, it's foundational. This lineage diverged from the rest of humanity so far back in time, it nearly touches the edge of the human family tree. For the maternal side, the revelations are just as profound. The mitochondria, tiny powerhouses within our cells, carry their own DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child. And among the SAN and other cosine groups, researchers discovered an ancient mitochondrial branch known as haplogroup L0, particularly subclades L0D and L0K. These aren't distant cousins of modern humans. They are, in many ways, our direct genetic grandmothers. What makes this so groundbreaking is not just their age, but their continuity. These lineages haven't been revived from fossilized bone. They're alive and uninterrupted, passed from one generation to the next across tens of thousands of years. No broken chains, no missing links, a living transmission from prehistory. And yet, this inheritance is anything but simple. Take the Herero and Dama, two distinct ethnic groups with different languages and cultural identities. You might expect their maternal DNA to reflect that difference, but it doesn't. Studies show they both carry a strikingly similar mitochondrial signature, a high frequency of type 21-2, a pattern so precise it could only have come from a shared female ancestor. One woman, likely living thousands of years ago, who unknowingly gave rise to two nations. Then there's the Ambo, whose maternal line deviates sharply. Their DNA holds different mitochondrial types, one's more closely related to southeastern Bantu speakers. This divergence suggests an entirely separate migratory path, one that bypassed the routes taken by the Herero and Dama. These aren't abstract genetics. These are real people with living lineages, their ancestries mapped through generations of daughters and sons, carried not in stories, but in blood. And there's something almost poetic about it. While written history often records the deeds of kings and warriors, genetics reminds us that the truest continuity lies not in thrones, but in mothers and fathers whose names we'll never know, yet whose legacy lives in every heartbeat of those walking Namibia today. So when we talk about the mothers and fathers of humanity, it's not a metaphor, it's a scientific reality. And Namibia, more than almost any place on Earth, holds their echo. In the quiet of the dunes, in the hands of a newborn, in the gaze of an elder whose DNA reaches deeper than any family tree ever drawn. They were here long before history began, and they are still here. There are stories that never made it into books, civilizations that rose and fell with no written record, lives that were never carved into stone. But somewhere deep inside ourselves, the memory of those lost voices still survives. In Namibia, that memory is especially sharp, because while history can be manipulated, rewritten, or forgotten, DNA cannot. It keeps the secrets even when language vanishes. It preserves truths that colonial records erased, that borders distorted, and that oral tradition couldn't always protect. And in Namibia, those genetic truths refuse to stay silent. Consider the Ambo, a Bantu-speaking population in the region. On the surface, they share cultural ties with neighboring groups, but their mitochondrial DNA tells a different story, one that links them not to their western neighbors, but more closely to southeastern Bantu-speaking communities, hundreds of kilometers away. It's a migration route not marked on maps. It's only visible in the blood. Then there's the contradiction of the Dama and Herero, two groups that look and sound distinct, yet carry nearly identical maternal genetic signatures. While one speaks Nama, a click language of the Kosan family, and the other speaks a Western Bantu tongue, both trace back to a shared maternal ancestry. Not centuries ago, millennia ago. How could such different identities emerge from the same maternal line? That's the power of genetic data. It exposes where memory ends and biology begins. Even more surprising is how environment and terrain shape these stories. Namibia's mountains, rivers, and arid expanses didn't just influence trade routes. They defined human survival. Communities settled where water flowed and soil yielded food. And in doing so, they intermarried, migrated, or stayed isolated, each decision leaving a genetic fingerprint that no written history ever documented. When geneticists examine Namibia's populations, they don't find a clean narrative. they find contradiction. A mosaic of ancestries that overlap, diverge, then overlap again. It's as if the country itself holds a palimpsest of migrations, overwritten again and again, but never fully erased. And that complexity matters, because it means our assumptions about ethnicity, race, and origin are often oversimplified. People we once labeled as unrelated turn out to be ancient kin. Others, once grouped together, are shown to be strangers on the genetic map. The truth is messier, and far more fascinating. But this is not just a lesson in genetics. It's a challenge to how we define identity. Can we still call someone a minority when their ancestry predates recorded history? Can we dismiss a language as dying when the genes of its speakers carry a timeline older than most empires? In Namibia, every genome is a rebellion against historical erasure. These genes do not forget. They remember migrations never documented, marriages never recorded, betrayals never confessed. They remember a continent long before it was named Africa, when humans weren't divided by language, but united by survival. And in the silence between genetic markers, there is something else: resilience. A quiet refusal to vanish, to be misnamed, to be simplified. Because no matter how many times history turned away, the DNA remained. It waited. And now, it's finally being heard. In the quiet hush of Namibia's deserts, the future hums beneath the surface. It doesn't shine like steel. It doesn't announce itself with satellites or skyscrapers. It's hidden, buried inside the double helix of those who've endured the longest. What if the key to tomorrow's medicine, our fight against disease, even the very way we understand the human body, is locked in the DNA of people whose ancestors never left the cradle of humanity? Modern science is beginning to realize what the land has known all along. Ancient genes are not just relics of the past. They are blueprints. They are instructions. They are survival encoded. Namibia's people, especially the indigenous Sand and Khoisan groups, carry a genetic diversity so expansive. It's like opening a library that's been sealed for 200,000 years. Each strand of DNA holds rare variants, combinations of alleles and haplotypes that exist nowhere else on Earth. And that uniqueness, it's priceless. Why? Because medicine is no longer one-size-fits-all. It's entering a new era, precision medicine, where treatments are tailored to individual genomes. And if those treatments are to be truly effective, they must account for the deepest roots of genetic variation. Without the African genetic context, especially the Southern African context, medical science risks treating only part of the human story. Already, studies have shown that certain Namibian genetic profiles affect how individuals process drugs, how they respond to medication for hypertension, how their immune system fights infections like HIV or tuberculosis, how their bodies metabolize treatments for cancer. In other words, the DNA of Namibia's most ancient populations may help save lives far beyond its borders. But this isn't just a scientific opportunity, it's an ethical test. Because for decades, the genetic material of indigenous Africans has been extracted, studied, published, but not always respected. There's a dark history here, where knowledge was taken, benefits weren't shared, and the people whose DNA unlocked breakthroughs were left out of the conversation. Now, as Namibia stands on the edge of a genomic revolution, there is a chance to do it differently. Some researchers are pushing for community-centered science, where Sand and Khoisan voices lead the discussion, where consent is sacred, where knowledge is not mined, but shared, where technology doesn't erase tradition, it amplifies it. There's also innovation happening in real time. Namibia is considering policies for newborn genetic screening, not to control, but to protect, to catch diseases early, to understand genetic risks from birth, to offer a healthier future that begins the moment life does. Beyond humans, even the wild environment is being mapped. Through environmental DNA, researchers are decoding entire ecosystems, tracking endangered species, understanding ancient migration patterns, and using genetic data to guide conservation before extinction arrives. It's a future powered by the past, a scientific frontier made possible only because a few ancient lineages survived, unbroken, unbent, unburied. So while the rest of the world looks to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and space travel for progress, Namibia offers a different kind of future, one that doesn't escape our biology, but understands it better than ever before. Because if we want to build a more human tomorrow, we must begin with the humans who've carried our origin for longer than anyone else. In the end, the most advanced technology on Earth may still be the human body itself, and its oldest version is still walking barefoot across the Namib.